So imagine you're driving down the highway, right? And you get pulled over by a traffic cop.
Never a fun experience.
No, exactly. So you roll down the window, and the officer hands you a ticket. And the violation on the citation reads, uh, taking care not to wear your seatbelt loosely in order to sit comfortably.
Okay, very specific.
Right. So you look at the officer and you say, wait, I didn't loosen it to sit comfortably. I loosened it because, the fabric was snagging on my jacket. Like, my motive wasn't comfort.
And the officer's just going to stare at you.
Exactly. Just a blank stare. Because he doesn't care about your jacket, and he definitely doesn't care about your comfort. The crime is the loose seatbelt. The phrase to sit comfortably is just, the law's way of describing why people usually break that rule.
Right. It's a structural reality of the language. The mandate is the physical action itself. The motive is just descriptive context. Like if you wear the belt loosely, you break the law, regardless of what is happening in your head.
And today, we are taking that exact grounded legal logic and, well, applying it to a document that completely overturns a 2,000-year-old assumption. Welcome to today's deep dive. If you're someone who loves those big aha moments and, appreciates having your assumptions challenged, you are in the right place.
We're looking at a source text titled Reinterpretation of Matthew 6.
Yeah, and it focuses on one of the most, universally recognized teachings in ancient literature. Jesus telling his followers, "Take heed that you do not do your charitable deeds before men to be seen by them."
Which is huge because for centuries, the standard reading of that verse has been entirely psychological.
Right.
The assumption is that it's this test of your internal pride. The traditional interpretation argues that Jesus is basically saying, if you were doing charity in public just to feed your ego and get applause, well, that's a sin. But if your heart is pure and your intentions are good, then public charity is perfectly fine.
We've basically treated it as an ultimatum about hypocrisy.
Uh,
Which feels intuitive, right?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
we are just so conditioned to think about morality
Yeah.
in terms of our internal feelings. Like, if I mean well, I must be doing good.
Sure.
But the author of our source document points out a massive flaw in that framework.
Yep.
They argue that Jesus wasn't dealing with hypocrisy or pride in this verse at all.
Great. At all.
At all. The source says he was cautioning against a breach of a strict spiritual protocol. He was banning the display of work that was explicitly designed by God to remain secret.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because to understand how we got this wrong for so long, we really have to look closely at the grammar, which is exactly why that traffic cop analogy you brought up is so crucial.
Yeah.
The source asks us to basically strip away the centuries of religious and theological baggage and simply look at how a sentence is built.
So let's run with the legal angle then, because the source uses another example that I think really drives the mechanics of this home. Imagine a defense attorney instructing a police department, and the lawyer says, make sure you do not use excessive force against my client to get information from him.
Okay, clear enough.
Right, but if we apply the traditional sort of religious way of reading text to that sentence, the police could theoretically beat the suspect up simply out of, I don't know, frustration or anger, and then claim they didn't break the rule because their motive wasn't to extract information.
Which, would be immediately thrown out of any courtroom on earth.
Right.
What's fascinating here is that the lawyer is categorically banning the use of excessive force, period. The addition of the phrase to get information is just an adverbial clause of purpose.
Meaning what exactly in everyday terms?
Meaning, in legal grammar, it does not define the prohibition. It simply identifies the most common human incentive for committing the violation. Like, the lawyer includes it to show they understand why the police might be tempted to break the rule, but the rule itself is absolute.
Okay, so mapping that grammatical structure directly onto Matthew 6, the phrase to be seen by men functions identically to get information or, to sit comfortably.
Yeah.
Jesus is categorically banning the public display of these charitable deeds. He mentions the desire for human applause only to acknowledge, why people usually want to do these things in public. It's descriptive, not conditional.
Exactly. The structure is absolute because if his primary concern in that sentence was the purity of your intentions, the grammar of the subsequent verses wouldn't be so rigid.
Good point.
He immediately follows up by saying, therefore, do not sound a trumpet before you. He doesn't offer a caveat.
Right. He doesn't say, do not sound a trumpet unless you're feeling incredibly humble today.
Exactly. He dictates a physical spatial boundary. Do it in secret. The focus shifts entirely from internal psychology to external obedience.
I can see how human nature would want to soften that, though.
Mm.
I mean, it is profoundly uncomfortable to be told that an action is just flat out wrong, regardless of how pure your heart is.
No, absolutely.
We desperately want to believe that our good intentions are this, like get out of jail free card for crossing boundaries. If we convince ourselves the text is just a test of our pride, then we are the ones who get to grade the test. We get to say, well, my heart was in the right place, so I'm exempt from the rule.
And that is the exact psychological comfort that traditional interpretation provides. It takes a hard, objective boundary and turns it into a subjective, internal feeling. But the text simply doesn't support that kind of grammatical gymnastics. The prohibition targets the practical issue of public worship, not the intentions of the worshiper.
I'm struggling with this, though, and I think anyone who has, spent time studying these ancient texts would naturally push back here.
Sure, it's a big shift.
Because historically, Jesus' entire method of operation is fixing the human heart. Like that is his defining characteristic as a teacher. He's the one who said that if you even look at someone with lust, you've already committed adultery in your heart.
Right, the Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah. He constantly moves the battleground from external behaviors to internal psychology. So if wanting to be seen by men is clearly an issue of pride, why wouldn't we assume he's addressing that internal psychology here? I mean, it seems completely out of character for him to suddenly ignore the heart and just focus on a physical action.
And that tension is exactly why the psychological reading of this text has survived largely unchallenged for 2 millennia. It aligns perfectly with our broader understanding of his teachings.
Right.
But our source material anticipates this specific objection and deconstructs it using a really brilliant piece of theological logic, going right back to your example about adultery.
Okay, how so?
Well, consider how ancient societies dealt with behavioral sins like adultery. The historical, practical solution was to create physical barriers.
Like literal walls.
Literally, you locked people away, you created strict segregation, or you used the threat of extreme physical punishment, like public stoning, to enforce the boundary. The ancient world used physical geography and physical threats to control behavior.
Right. It was an external war on an external action.
But Jesus completely rejected that framework. He didn't endorse stoning. He didn't tell people to physically isolate themselves from anyone they might be attracted to. He taught that the true source of behavioral sin is the human heart.
Because if the disease is in the mind and the spirit, physical geography cannot cure it.
Exactly.
Okay, I see where the source is going with this. You don't cure a disease of the mind by simply changing the room you're standing in.
It's a fundamental mismatch of remedy and ailment. Think about it. If Jesus refused to offer a physical spatial solution for an external sin like adultery because he knew the root was internal,
Right.
why on earth would he suddenly offer a physical spatial solution like hiding in a closet to do your charity to fix an internal intention like pride?
Oh, wow. Because it wouldn't work.
It wouldn't work at all.
If I have an ego problem and I'm just obsessed with how righteous I am,
Mm-hmm.
doing my charity in a dark, locked room doesn't cure my pride. It just creates a new, arguably more insidious version of it.
Yeah. Like, I could be sitting alone in the dark, entirely in secret, just beaming with arrogance about how much more spiritual and obedient I am than everyone else who gives publicly.
It's what you might call closet pride.
Closet pride, yeah.
If his goal in Matthew 6 was to eradicate pride, the prescription of physical secrecy is an absolute failure. It completely misses the root of the issue. The source document notes that if Jesus truly intended to address the psychology of pride in this specific verse, he left a gaping loophole by only addressing the pride of public applause, while ignoring the massive potential for private arrogance.
The logic there is incredibly tight. I mean, we are basically forced to accept that he's not trying to cure pride with this instruction.
Right.
The grammatical structure doesn't support conditional rule, and the theological context proves that a physical barrier is the wrong tool for an internal problem. Which leaves us with this really stark conclusion. The attempt to be seen by men, while, certainly a human flaw, is not the reason the practice of public charity is banned. The ban is on the method itself. The method is the violation. He is establishing a strict mandate about how this specific work is to be performed.
But, and here's where it gets really interesting, that creates a massive new problem.
How so?
If the secrecy isn't about hiding our pride, why does God demand it? Why ban the public display of good deeds at all? Because if we pull back and look at the broader context, just one chapter earlier in Matthew 5, Jesus is recorded telling a crowd, You are the light of the world. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven.
Ah, yes.
That is literally the opposite instruction. In chapter 5, it's let your light shine so men can see your works. In chapter 6, it's hide your works so men cannot see them. How is that not a flat-out contradiction?
I mean, it reads like a glaring contradiction until you recognize that he is talking about two entirely different categories of spiritual works.
Okay.
The source document draws a very sharp, definitive line between the works described in Matthew 5 and the works described in Matthew 6. They are not interchangeable, and they do not serve the same function.
Let's define those categories then, starting with Matthew 5. What are the works that are supposed to be the light of the world?
So the Matthew 5 works, in the context of the early texts in Jesus' ministry, are the miraculous works. We're talking about healing the sick, raising the dead, casting out illnesses.
The big stuff.
The big stuff. According to the text, these are works provided and powered by the Holy Spirit alone. The individual believer is just a conduit, and they have a highly specific operational purpose. They are designed to win souls. They exist to display the raw power and glory of God publicly as evidence for the masses.
So by definition, a Matthew 5 work requires an audience. Like, you cannot and should not hide a miracle that is explicitly meant to serve as public proof of the divine.
Exactly. To hide a Matthew 5 work would defeat its entire purpose. But then you transition into the works of Matthew 6. This is the second category. These are the works of the law. Giving alms to the poor, engaging in deep prayer, the practice of fasting.
Which are personal disciplines. I mean, there's nothing inherently miraculous about me giving a portion of my paycheck to someone in need or, skipping a meal to pray.
Right. And because they are not miraculous, they are not the designated tools for displaying God's glory to the masses to win souls. Their purpose points inward, not outward.
Got it.
These works are tools given directly to the individual believer to forge personal righteousness. They are the mechanisms of a discrete, intimate relationship between the human and the divine.
I love the imagery the source provided for this. They say, think of a vast, icy mountain range. Total, majestic isolation. And in the center of that quiet emptiness, picture two hands reaching out toward each other, just inches away from connecting.
It's a beautiful image.
It really is. That's what a Matthew 6 work is. It's not a performance on a stage. It's that quiet, isolated connection in a space where no one else exists. It's the architecture of intimacy.
And the source refers to this dynamic as a spiritual protocol. I actually think that phrase is the skeleton key for unlocking this entire text.
A spiritual protocol.
Yes. Because a protocol is not a suggestion. It is the established code of procedure required for a system to function correctly. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the text is claiming that God expects all spiritual work that is not intended to win souls to remain absolutely discreet.
Because introducing a third party into an intimate protocol fundamentally destroys the intimacy. It changes the nature of the interaction.
Exactly.
Even in our normal human relationships, we understand this instinctively, right? Like, if I have a deeply personal, vulnerable conversation with my partner, that conversation relies on a closed loop. It belongs to us.
Right.
If I secretly record that conversation and broadcast it on the internet, well, I have violated the protocol of that relationship.
And here is where the mechanical reality overtakes the psychological excuse. It does not matter why you broadcasted the recording.
Yeah.
You might tell your partner, but my motives were pure. I just thought the conversation was beautiful, and I wanted other people to learn from our love.
Yeah, try telling that to your partner.
Exactly. Your pure motive does not repair the breach of trust. You took something explicitly designed for the private space and forced it into the public square.
You broke the protocol. The damage is done by the physical action of the broadcast, not the feeling in your heart when you hit the publish button.
This is the paradigm shift the source is demanding. God's intention from the beginning for these specific works, charity, personal prayer, fasting, was centered on discretion. They are private conversations. To publicize what God explicitly designed for private intimacy is a direct act of disobedience to divine order, period.
Wow.
It does not matter how pure your intentions might be. It does not matter if you have completely eradicated pride from your heart. If you take an act of personal worship that was given to you as a tool for a secret connection with the divine and you make it public, you have broken the mechanism.
That reframes the entire concept of obedience. Like it takes the idea of a good deed out of this blurry, subjective gray area where we constantly justify our actions based on our internal feelings.
Right, no more guesswork.
Yeah, we no longer have to play psychological games with ourselves, constantly checking our pulse to see if we're feeling too proud. The boundary is objective. God has drawn a line around a very specific type of intimacy, and the requirement is simply to respect the boundary.
The warning against publicizing charity is not a mirror to show you your own arrogance. It is a fence designed to protect a sacred space. When Jesus says, "Take heed that you do not do your charitable deeds before men," he is explaining how the machinery of intimacy actually works. The moment you perform it for an audience, the connection to the divine is severed because the tool is being used for a purpose it was never designed for.
So if we pull all these threads together, the journey of this reinterpretation is actually quite breathtaking.
It really is.
We started with a verse that for centuries has been used as a tool for religious anxiety. A way to stress test your own motives, to see if you're secretly a fraud. Am I giving this money for the applause? Am I a hypocrite? But by analyzing the fundamental grammar of the law, remembering the loose seatbelt, understanding that the motive is just a descriptive clause, we realize the text isn't interested in our feelings. It's governing a physical method.
And by recognizing the logical mismatch of trying to cure internal pride with external hiding places, we cleared away the last remnants of that psychological interpretation. Jesus wasn't offering a naive physical remedy for an internal disease.
Which brought us to the ultimate realization, the distinction between public miracles meant to be the light of the world and private disciplines meant to build the self. We were looking at a beautifully strict architecture of intimacy, a spiritual protocol.
It entirely changes the tone of the ancient text. It transforms the verse from a harsh, accusatory ultimatum about your hidden hypocrisy into a profound, protective invitation.
I love that, a protective invitation.
Yeah. It's an invitation to cultivate a space that belongs to absolutely no one else but you and the divine.
And that concept of a protected private space feels more urgent now than it probably ever has in human history. Because if we step out of the ancient texts for a moment and look at the reality of the world you and I live in right now, we exist in a culture of relentless exposure.
Oh, without a doubt.
Almost every good deed, every charitable donation, every personal milestone, every moment of spiritual or emotional growth is documented. We live in a hyper-connected age where the instinct is to immediately broadcast our lives for public consumption.
We have been conditioned to believe that an event doesn't fully hold value unless it has been witnessed and validated by an audience.
But if the underlying logic of this source material holds true, if there are certain actions, certain connections, and certain moments of personal growth fundamentally designed by the very fabric of the universe to exist only in secret, what is the cost of our constant broadcasting?
That's the real question.
How much of our own lives, our own deep internal development, are we publicizing that was actually explicitly designed to be a quiet, secret connection just for us? Are we trading profound, isolated intimacy for the cheap validation of a public audience, simply because we've convinced ourselves our motives are pure?
It forces us to ask whether our desire to be seen is actually destroying the very tools meant to build us.
It's a heavy question, but it's the exact kind of question that makes digging into these sources so rewarding. We want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive. It's a privilege to take a magnifying glass to the assumptions we've held for a lifetime and discover an entirely new landscape underneath. Keep questioning the things you think you already know, keep looking for the mechanics behind the text, and remember that sometimes the most profound and transformative connections you will ever make are the ones that happen when absolutely no one else is watching.